now we turn to the state of Maine. Now, a couple weeks ago, right after President Trump took office, he issued an executive order that reclaimed the definition of what it means to be a woman. He reclaimed what the definition of sex discrimination is. This, of course, is the Title IX redefinition that the Biden administration had played around with, where they said sex discrimination doesn't just apply to discrimination against women or discrimination against men. They expanded the definition of sex to include gender identity. Because of that, biological men in schools across the country, and yes, this is happening in schools across the country, biological men were allowed to play on women's sports teams. Biological men were harming women. We showed this a couple months ago on the there was a college volleyball game in which a biological man who identified as a woman spiked the volleyball into the face of an actual female on a different team, and that female's face was broken. Well, that's not the only example of it. Riley Gaines, of course, lost to Leah Thomas, formerly known as Will Thomas, a man masquerading as a woman. And a United Nations report said that 900 medals in competitions around the world have been won by biological men pretending to be women in women's competitions. This is not only unsafe, it's unfair, and it completely rejects reality. Well, thank you to President Trump. He reclaimed the definition of what it means to be a woman, and biological men are no longer allowed to play in women's sports in America. And yet in the state of Maine, which is governed by a far leftist feminist by the name of Janet Mills, she's the governor up there, Maine has defied President Trump's order. Now, in addition to that first order, simply reclaiming the definition of man and woman, President Trump specifically signed an order that said that states will face repercussions if they allow biological men to play women's sports, even if those biological men are pretending to be women. Maine is doing just that. Maine is defying President Trump and says that they will continue to allow biological men to play in women's sports. President Trump, however, had all of the governors to the White House yesterday and picked Janet Mills out of the crowd to address her directly, saying, do you really want this to happen? Do you want me to withhold federal funding from the state of Maine because you are allowing biological men to play in women's sports? The night before the governor's meeting, he had floated this idea publicly as a signal to Governor Mills to warn her what was about to happen to her state if she did not follow the law as signed by the chief executive. And this is what he said. Take a look.
I heard men are still playing in Maine. Is anybody here from Maine? Who is that? Is that the governor? Well, I hate to tell you this, but we're not going to give them any federal money. They are still saying we want men to play in women's sports, and I cannot believe that they're doing that. They are, let's find out who that guy is that raised his hand. Maybe he's just kidding. But, so we're not going to give them any federal funding, none whatsoever, until they clean that up.
We're not going to give them any federal funding. Well, according to Reuters, he spoke with the governors this morning. It was not yesterday, it was this morning. Let me correct that. And Donald Trump was talking to both Democrat and Republican governors at the White House, and he got into a war of words with Maine's governor, Janet Mills. He, of course, was talking about his executive order banning transgender identifying athletes in sports when she objected. And Trump responded to her by saying, you better do it because you're not going to get federal funding. According to Reuters, Mills responded with, we're going to follow the law, sir. We'll see you in court. And Trump reportedly shot back and said, enjoy your life after governor because I don't think you'll be an elected official afterwards. So to discuss what's happening in the state of Maine, we are going to bring in a state representative from Auburn, a city in Maine, Representative Laurel Libby. Representative Libby, thank you for joining the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
All right. Well, it seems like there's some exciting times in Maine right now. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek because it's pretty obvious that men should not be allowed to play in women's sports. But Maine is an interesting political mashup. I described it earlier in the show as being a little tiny piece of California because it used to be a red state. In recent years, it's become very blue, especially in the Portland area and in cities. And many of the very radical leftist policies in California next actually go to Maine before going to other blue states around the country. So talk to me about your governor, Janet Mills. Talk to me about this defiance of President Trump's executive order on allowing disallowing, I should say, men from playing in women's sports.
Yeah, absolutely. As soon as as President Trump issued his executive order, we heard feedback from the Maine Principals Association, who said, we are going to, in defiance of this executive order, we are going to continue to allow boys to play in girls' sports. And so, sure enough, this past Monday, a biological male participated in the Maine State Championship for indoor track and field and won first place in girls pole vaulting, displacing a Maine girl from winning that prize.
Which it's funny to me when the left looks at this and says that's not happening. Men who identify as girls aren't winning. Yes, they are in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities. This is in fact happening. So, I mean, tell me about your constituents. Tell me about what people think about this, because it seems to me that it does cross party lines, that parents and athletes, regardless of whether you vote Republican or Democrat, don't think this is fair. And yet you have the Principals Association in Maine, as well as the governor, wanting to take this really fringe position on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyday Mainers don't believe that boys belong in girls' sports. And that lines up with the rest of the country, right? 79% of people do not believe that boys should be participating in girls' sports. It's not fair. And so that's what I hear from Maine people. There is the fringe that thinks that this is acceptable, that it's okay for boys to be beating girls who've worked so hard, right? Think about all of the time and energy and effort that goes into excelling at your given sport, and to have that taken away from someone who shouldn't be participating. It's just not fair for Maine girls. And it's unfortunate that the folks who are in power in our state have determined that this is to be law in Maine. And that's where the federal government has to come in, has to step in and intervene and say this is not acceptable, because the powers that be in Maine won't protect girls.
And this is a pretty significant and appropriate, by the way, response from President Trump to say, okay, if you're going to defy not only reality, but if you're going to defy my executive order, you're not going to get federal assistance. What are your constituents telling you about that? Because that's also going to impact, it's not going to impact Janet Mills. She has, a cushy elitist life as a politician, but it will impact everyday Mainers.
Absolutely. I posted about this on Monday, and that kind of started off this whole brouhaha, right? And since then, I've been hearing from those Mainers. I've been hearing from girls who are being pushed aside in sports. I've been hearing from parents who are concerned about their kids. I've been hearing from grandparents who don't want to see girls pushed aside and silenced in this arena. And so that's who I'm hearing from here in Maine, constituents who care about fairness for Maine girls and ensuring that they have every opportunity before them, and that they have an even playing field instead of one that is so convoluted with allowing biological males to participate and to dominate in their fields.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not only unfair, it's actually unsafe for these women as well if it's any kind of contact sport. Like I gave the example of the volleyball team. This just happened a couple months ago out in California. So what's the recourse here? The Maine Principals Association, as well as this threat to see you in court from Janet Mills. That's taxpayer money that will be funding that could be used for something else. But what's the Republican plan in Maine to hold Janet Mills accountable or to prevent this from harming Mainers?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are going to be bills coming before the legislature this session that Maine people can make their voices heard on to demand that biological males are not permitted to participate in female sports. So that is certainly an opportunity for folks to speak up loudly and clearly and make sure that the governor and the Democrat legislature hear them. And that's certainly one mechanism to fix this problem. But I really do think the solution is going to come from the federal government, whether that is challenged in court or not. I think that is, at the end of the day, the solution, because the Democrat majority isn't listening to Maine people. And so we need to let the dollar talk here.
Yeah, and something I often find interesting about elected representatives is some of them are ideological and some of them are just fearful of getting voted out of office. What are your colleagues like? Are they very much committed to the transgender ideology, or are they just worried, I kind of represent a leftist area, they're telling me that they want transgenderism, so even though I'm one of those 79% that don't really think that it's true, I got to do what these people say. Like, what are we dealing with in Maine?
Yeah, the Democrat majority is not a majority that really listens to Maine people. They're pretty committed to their ideology, and I don't think they have any understanding that this really is an 80-20 issue where they are just wrong, and that they're not listening to their constituents. They're not listening to the majority of Mainers who don't think it's right to allow boys to participate in girls' sports. I don't anticipate that they will listen, and that's why I say we've got this two-pronged approach, right? Mainers should make their voices heard on the coming legislation, but also I think the solution is going to be found via the federal government, because we do have a Democrat governor, we have a Democrat House and Senate majority, and they're not listening.
Yeah, and one of the things that Congressman Chip Roy told me, this was the end of last year. I had asked him, listen, when we make a lot of calls to your office and send a lot of emails and text and tag you on X, does that make a difference in how people vote? And he was like, yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot. Yes, that makes a difference in how elected representatives act, because they do fear losing their power, and they, rightly fear losing their seat in an election. And so one of the great things that we do on this show is when there's an issue like this, we make our voices heard in a very polite but very firm way. So if you are a resident of Maine, make sure you reach out to your elected representative. I don't care if they are the most radically leftist, transgender, ideology committed person. Reach out to them, email them, call them, text them, anything. Send them a letter, tag them on X, on Instagram. Let them know that they are in the fringe minority, that it is an 80-20 issue, as Representative Libby says. And even if you're not in the state of Maine, listen, when federal funding is going from the federal government, which we all fund, and is going to a state, we also have a right to make our voices heard regardless of whether we live in that state. So make a little ruckus about this, because it does make a difference, especially when these Democrats are in the fringe. Representative Libby, thanks for being on the show. Keep us updated about this, because Maine is kind of a petri dish, I think, sometimes for how these leftist policies, or in this case, defiance of an executive order, how it's going to play out in other states. So we'll be watching interestedly. So keep us in the loop.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on.
Of course, it was a pleasure to have you.